According to OECD, the highest performing educational systems are those that combine equity with quality. They give all children opportunities for a quality education, which improves opportunities for them and society as a whole. However, controversy still exists about how to achieve equity, and more fundamentally, how we define and measure it. For example, making sure that schools get what they need can be a technically complex and political endeavor. Students in schools have different socio-economic requirements, which funding schemes should reflect. New Zealand, in this regard, has implemented two innovative funding schemes to ensure equity in their early learning system. 1. Equity funding, and 2. Targeted funding for disadvantaged. Here is some information about these funding schemes and how they address educational inequity in the context of New Zealand. What is equity funding? Subsidy equity funding is paid 3 times a year, like early childhood education funding. It provides additional educational resources to targeted communities, which are based on the equity index set by the government. The equity index is updated every 5 years in line with New Zealand's census cycle. So how does equity funding help address the issue of inequity in New Zealand's early learning system? First, by targeting specific groups in need, it reduces educational disparities. Equity funding consists of the following 4 components. Component A, low social-economic communities. Component B, students with special needs and from non-English speaking backgrounds. Component C, children whose language and culture is other than English, including sign language. And Component D, children who live in relatively isolated areas. Schools typically use equity funding to increase children's participation, and they support them by providing basic needs such as transportation, food, and by removing or discounting fees. Once these needs are met, any surplus of equity funding is spent for educational experiences for the children and providing additional staff members. So, by focusing on specific target groups determined by data, equity funding reduces barriers to participation faced by academically underrepresented groups. Let's explore how another funding scheme, targeted funding for disadvantaged, has ensured equity in early learning systems in New Zealand. In 2018, the Government of New Zealand introduced target funding for disadvantaged as a new equity funding source. Targeted funding is a separate funding stream for licensed early childhood education services with 20% or more of their students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Targeted funding must be spent with the equity objectives for participation and quality in mind. Accordingly, the government suggests the following specific areas for spending. Number 1. Working with families. A stimulating home learning environment has significant long-term benefits for children. Teachers and educators who effectively collaborate with families can increase children's learning opportunities. So targeted funding is spent on things like libraries from which families can borrow books, literacy and numeracy resources which families can use at home, or community hubs for families. Number 2. Removing barriers to learning. Targeted funding can be spent on reducing fees, which are barriers to participation, sending families text messages, reminders to promote regular attendance, or funding trips to local museums or the library. Number 3. Enriching learning environments. To ensure positive learning experiences, targeted funding can be spent on books, resources and equipment that support children's needs, physical and early language development and literacy, or on small projects such as planting and maintaining a vegetable garden or baking and cooking. Number 4. Supporting teachers and parents. The last area that targeted funding can be spent on is supporting ongoing professional development of teachers and improving parental understanding of their children's needs. For example, arranging meetings to explore collaborative opportunities and solutions between teachers and parents. By using these strategies, targeted funding aims to improve the affordability and quality of early learning for children from disadvantaged backgrounds and ensure they start school ready to learn. We can learn two major lessons from how equity funding and targeted funding work. First, make funding strategies responsive to students' and schools' needs. Second, how resources are spent makes a difference. While there are many different ways to ensure equity in education, as we have learned from New Zealand's case, a well-designed funding formula can be one of the most efficient, stable, and transparent methods of ensuring equity, especially for specific target groups. This type of approach may be difficult to implement and may not cover all school costs. However, with transparency and sufficiently detailed and reliable data, it is not impossible.